Hail Internet! It's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's actually a special day in that we're participating in the Tolkien Society's annual Tolkien Reading Day. March 25th, the day the ring was destroyed in Mount Doom, is the day when Tolkien fans are encouraged to read passages inspired by a particular topic. And this year, the Tolkien Society's topic is hope and courage. Oh, this actually is my box set of the trilogy. I got it from my dad. This is kind of my sacred tome. You probably have your own version at home. So, several of the Tolkien-themed YouTubers have created a Tolkien Reading Day playlist. The playlist includes some of the major Tolkien channels like Men of the West and Nerd of the Rings, and some small channels like the Dork Lords. So it's an honor to be a part of this playlist. I will put a link to it at the end of this video. So, hope and courage. There's some obvious examples, right? Frodo and Sam exemplify hope and courage. Aragorn's assumed name when he was a child in the care of Elrond was Estel, which is Elven for hope, and he was certainly courageous during the events of The Lord of the Rings. But I thought I'd go for something a little off the beaten path. Few characters embody the theme of hope and courage more than Amandil. Now, if you come at Tolkien through The Lord of the Rings, you might be asking, who? I think Amandil only appears briefly in the appendices. But for someone who's never mentioned in the trilogy, he has a huge part to play in it. The Third Age of Middle-earth would be completely rewritten without him. So, who is he? He's Earendil's father, Isildur's grandfather, and ancestor, obviously, of Aragorn. His life is defined by one dramatic choice that he makes late in the Second Age. But like any character in Tolkien mythology, you have to put him in context. It's one of the fantastic features of Tolkien's writing. You can pick out any character in a vacuum, tell their story, and it would be interesting. But if you show how that character fits into the giant story web that is Tolkien's mythology, it becomes magical. As I mentioned, Amandil lived in the Second Age. War of the Ring is in the Third Age, so this is thousands of years before that. But it's also thousands of years after the First Age, which is where our story begins. So, put a pin in Amandil. We're going to come back to him, but we're going to start in the First Age with Earendil. I could do an entire video on Earendil. In fact, I have. But briefly, Earendil and his wife Elwing are half-elves, and they have twin sons, Elrond and Elros. Elros was the first king of Numenor, and as you'll see, shares a lineage with Amandil. So, Earendil is an ancestor of Amandil. Late in the First Age, Earendil and Elwing make a desperate bid to sail to Aman, risking almost certain death, because no mortal is allowed to sail to the Undying Lands. But they do so in an attempt to save Middle-earth from Morgoth. This passage is from the Silmarillion, chapter 24. Yet Earendil saw now no hope left in the lands of Middle-earth, and he turned again in despair and came not home, but sought back once more to Valinor with Elwing at his side. He stood now most often at the prow of Vingalot, and the Silmaril was bound upon his brow, and ever its light grew greater as they drew into the west. And the wise have said that it was by reason of the power of that holy jewel that they came in time to waters that no vessels, save those of the Teleri, had known. And they came to the enchanted isles and escaped their enchantment, and they came into the shadowy seas and passed their shadows. And they looked upon Tol Eressëa, the lonely isle, but tarried not. And at the last they cast anchor in the bay of Eldamar. And the Teleri saw the coming of that ship out of the east, and they were amazed, gazing from afar upon the light of the Silmaril, and it was very great. Then Earendil, first of living men, landed on the immortal shores, And he spoke there to Elwing, and to those that were with him. And they were 3 mariners who had sailed all the seas beside him. And Earendil said to them, Here none but myself shall set foot, lest you fall under the wrath of the Valar. But that peril I will take on myself alone, for the sake of the 2 kindreds. But Elwing answered, Then would our paths be sundered forever. But all thy perils I will take on myself also. And she leaped into the white foam and ran towards him. But Earendil was sorrowful, for he feared the anger of the lords of the west upon any of Middle-earth that should dare to pass the leaguer of Aman. And there they bade farewell to the companions of their voyage, and were taken from them forever. And Earendil went into Valinor and to the halls of Valimar, and never again set foot upon the lands of men. Then the Valar took counsel together, and they summoned Ulmo from the deeps of the sea, and Earendil stood before their faces, and delivered the errand of the 2 kindreds. Pardon he asked for the Noldor, and pity for their great sorrows, and mercy upon men and elves, and succor in their need. And his prayer was granted. But when all was spoken, Manwë gave judgment, and he said, In this matter the power of doom is given to me. The peril that he ventured for love of the 2 kindreds shall not fall upon Earendil, nor shall it fall upon Elwing his wife, who entered into peril for love of him. But they shall not walk again ever among elves or men in the outer lands. So this is also a great example of hope and courage. I read the extended description of the journey because it will come into play later. Also note that there were 3 mariners that sailed with them. So, Earendil and Elwing are not punished for their transgression. The Valar realize the altruistic nature of their quest. They haven't come to Aman for personal glory or immortality. They've come on behalf of elves and men to plead for assistance from the Valar. And so, the Valar listen and send an army to Middle-earth. Morgoth is sent into the void, Sauron is temporarily defeated, and the good guys win. Although, there is a major cataclysm, and much of Middle-earth falls into the sea. But, cost-benefit analysis, Earendil and Elwing save Middle-earth with their journey, aided by a Silmaril. However, having landed on Aman, they're not allowed to return to Middle-earth. Earendil eternally flies across the heavens in his ship Vingalot, bearing a Silmaril. That Silmaril is the evening star, or Venus. And I like the notion that at night, Elrond can gaze up at the heavens and see his father in the sky. Okay, now we cut to the Second Age, but we have one more stop to make before we reach Amandil. The island of Numenor was raised from the sea by the Valar as a gift to the Edain for aiding in the war against Morgoth at the end of the First Age, the War of Wrath. As I mentioned, Earendil's son, Elros, becomes the first king, and Numenor thrives. But just like in the First Age, how it was a no-no for mortals to sail west, the Valar restate their "don't sail west" policy. This is from the Akalabeth in the Silmarillion. Above all arts, they, Numenorians, nourished shipbuilding and seacraft. And they became mariners whose like shall never be again, since the world was diminished. And voyaging upon the wide seas was the chief feat and adventure of their hardy men in the gallant days of their youth. But the lords of Valinor forbade them to sail so far westward that the coasts of Numenor could no longer be seen. And for long the Dunedain were content, though they did not fully understand the purpose of this ban. But the design of Manwë was that the Numenorians should not be tempted to seek for the blessed realm, nor desire to overpass the limits set to their bliss, becoming enamored of the immortality of the Valar and the Eldar, and the lands where all things endure. At times, when the air was clear and the sun was in the east, the Numenorians would look out and descry far off in the west a city shining white on a distant shore, and a great harbor and a tower. But the wise among them knew that this distant land was not indeed the blessed realm of Valinor, but was Avalone, the haven of the Eldar upon Eressëa, easternmost of the Undying Lands. And thence at times the firstborn still would come sailing to Numenor. And they brought to Numenor many gifts, birds of song, and fragrant flowers, and herbs of great virtue. And a seedling they brought of Celeborn, the white tree that grew in the midst of Eressëa. And the tree grew and blossomed in the courts of the king in Armenelos. Nimloth it was named, and flowered in the evening, and the shadows of night it filled with its fragrance. Thus it was that because of the ban of the Valar, the voyages of the Dunedain in those days went ever eastward and not westward. So the ban of the Valar is in place. For a time, the Númenóreans are okay with it, and we see that elves from the island of Tol Eressëa come to Numenor bringing gifts, including a seedling from their sacred white tree, which becomes Nimloth in Numenor. Obviously, the white tree is a symbol that endures through the War of the Ring and beyond. A quick note on Amandil's heritage. You might be asking, why isn't he king of Numenor? In his time, the king is Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. The king is going to break the ban of the Valar. Amandil is the last lord of Andúnië. Andúnië is a city in Numenor, and the lords of Andúnië are the rulers of that region. Their lineage traces back to the daughter of one of the early kings of Numenor. The third king of Numenor was Tar Amandil. Not our Amandil, different guy. His son became the fourth king, Tar Earendil. Obviously, you can see where Amandil and Earendil get their names from. Now, Tar Elendil's oldest child was Silmarion, and if this was a few years later in Númenórean history, she would have become queen. But at that time, they were still going with the male heir takes the throne notion. So, Silmarion's younger brother becomes king of Numenor, but Silmarion's son becomes the first lord of Andúnië, ending with Amandil. So, the lords of Andúnië are cousins of the royal line, and when Numenor splits into two factions, the king's men, who are opposed to the ban of the Valar, and the faithful, who still honor elves and the Valar, the faithful are led by the lords of Andúnië. Ar-Pharazôn and Amandil are childhood friends, and as you'll see, he has Amandil as one of his counselors. In this next passage, Ar-Pharazôn has just defeated Sauron and decided to bring him back to Numenor as his prisoner. Spoiler alert, big mistake. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that for the better keeping of Sauron and of his oaths of fealty, he should be brought to Numenor, there to dwell as a hostage for himself and all his servants in Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desire. And Sauron passed over the sea and looked upon the land of Numenor and on the city of Armenelos in the days of its glory, and he was astounded, but his heart within was filled the more with envy and hate. Yet such was the cunning of his mind and mouth and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed, he had become closest to the secret counsels of the king. For flattery sweet as honey was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men. And seeing the favor that he had of their lord, all the counselors began to fawn upon him, save one alone, Amandil, lord of Andúnië. Then Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark, and of Melkor the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly and in the face of his people, and they for the most part followed him. Yet there dwelt still a remnant of the faithful. The chief among them, to whom they looked for leading and courage in evil days, was Amandil, counselor of the king, and his son Earendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion, then young men by the reckoning of Numenor. Amandil and Earendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Elros, though not of the ruling house, to whom belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armenelus. In the days of their youth together, Amandil had been dear to Pharazôn, and though he was of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Now he was dismissed, for Sauron hated him above all others in Numenor. But he was so noble, and had been so mighty a captain of the sea, that he was still held in honor by many of the people, and neither the king nor Sauron dared to lay hands on him as yet. Therefore Amandil withdrew to Ravenna, and all that he trusted still to be faithful he summoned to come thither in secret. For he feared that evil would now grow apace, and all the elf friends were in peril. And so it soon came to pass. Note that when Sauron first sees the wonders of the city of Armenelus, he's filled with envy. He's jealous of Numenor. And though he's able to manipulate Pharazôn and his counselors, the one man he can't turn is Amandil, the man he hates the most in Numenor. But he can turn Pharazôn against his longtime friend, and so he does. Amandil is dismissed from the council and is forced to flee Armenelus. Now remember the seedling for the white tree, Nimloth, that was brought to Numenor by the elves? Sauron wants it destroyed, because it's a symbol of the bond between elves and men. But the previous king of Numenor, Tar-Palantir, had made a prophecy that said, if the white tree died, then so would the line of kings. And Pharazôn took that prophecy very seriously. As it turns out, it was right on the money. And Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree, Nimloth the Fair, that grew in his courts, for it was a memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Valinor. At the first the king would not assent to this, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree, as was forspoken by Tar-Palantir. Thus in his folly, he who now hated the Eldar and the Valar vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Numenor. But when Amandil heard rumor of the evil purpose of Sauron, he was grieved to the heart, knowing that in the end Sauron would surely have his will. Then he spoke to Earendil and the sons of Earendil, recalling the tale of the trees of Valinor. And Isildur said no word, but went out by night and did a deed for which he was afterwards renowned. For he passed alone in disguise to Armenelus, and to the courts of the king, which were now forbidden to the faithful. And he came to the place of the tree, which was forbidden to all by the orders of Sauron. And the tree was watched day and night by guards in his service. At that time Nimloth was dark and bore no bloom, for it was late in the autumn, and its winter was nigh. And Isildur passed through the guards, and took from the tree a fruit that hung upon it, and turned to go. But the guard was aroused, and he was assailed, and fought his way out, receiving many wounds. And he escaped, and because he was disguised, it was not discovered who had laid hands on the tree. But Isildur came at last hardly back to Ravenna, and delivered the fruit to the hands of Amandil, ere his strength failed him. Then the fruit was planted in secret, and it was blessed by Amandil, and a shoot arose from it and sprouted in the spring. But when its first leaf opened, then Isildur, who had lain long and come near to death, arose and was troubled no more by his wounds. Here we have another great example of hope and courage. On the night before Nimloth is to be cut down and burned, Isildur risks his life to save a piece of fruit from the tree. Amandil plants the fruit, it sprouts, and those seeds are taken to Middle-earth, where over the course of thousands of years, they eventually lead to the white tree in Minas Tirith, that symbol of the unity between elves and men. But in the short term, it's not a good time to be living in Numenor. And here, as I mentioned earlier, is where we see the choice that defines Amandil's life. And this passage includes a passionate conversation between father and son, Amandil and Earendil. Then Pharazôn, being besotted, and walking under the shadow of death, for his span was drawing towards its end, hearkened to Sauron, and he began to ponder in his heart how he might make war upon the Valar. And Amandil, becoming aware of the purposes of the king, was dismayed and filled with a great dread. For he knew that men could not vanquish the Valar in war, and that ruin must come upon the world if this war were not stayed. Therefore he called his son Earendil, and he said to him, "The days are dark, and there is no hope for men, for the faithful are few. Therefore I am minded to try that counsel which our forefather Earendil took of old, to sail into the west, be there ban or no, and to speak to the Valar, even to Manwë himself, if may be, and beseech his aid ere all is lost." "Would you then betray the king?" said Earendil. "For you know well the charge that they make against us, that we are traitors and spies, and that until this day it has been false." "If I thought that Manwë needed such a messenger," said Amandil, "I would betray the king. For there is but one loyalty from which no man can be absolved in heart for any cause. But it is for mercy upon men and their deliverance from Sauron the Deceiver that I would plead, since some at least have remained faithful. And as for the ban, I will suffer in myself the penalty, lest all my people should become guilty. But what think you, my father, is like to befall those of your house whom you leave behind when your deed becomes known?" "It must not become known," said Amandil. "I will prepare my going in secret, and I will set sail into the east, whither daily ships depart from our havens. And thereafter, as wind and chance may allow, I will go about, back into the west, and seek what I may find. But for you and your folk, my son, I counsel that you should prepare yourselves other ships, and put aboard all such things as your hearts cannot bear to part with. And when the ships are ready, you should lie in the haven of Ramenna, and give out among men that you purpose, when you see your time, to follow me into the east. Amandil is no longer so dear to our kinsman upon the throne that he will grieve overmuch if we seek to depart for a season or for good. But let it not be seen that you intend to take many men, or he will be troubled, because of the war that he now plots, for which he will need all the force that he may gather. Seek out the faithful that are known still to be true, and let them join you in secret, if they are willing to go with you, and share in your design." "And what shall that design be?" said Earendil. "To meddle not in the war, and to watch," answered Amandil. "Until I return, I can say no more. But it is most like that you shall fly from the land of the star, with no star to guide you, for that land is defiled. Then you shall lose all that you have loved, for tasting death in life, seeking a land of exile elsewhere. But east or west, the Valar alone can say." Then Amandil said farewell to all his household, as one that is about to die. "For," he said, "it may well prove that you will see me never again, and that I shall show you no such sign as Earendil showed long ago. But hold you ever in readiness, for the end of the world that we have known is now at hand." It is said that Amandil set sail in a small ship at night, and steered first eastward, and then went about and passed into the west. And he took with him 3 servants dear to his heart, and never again were they heard of by word or sign in this world, nor is there any tale or guess of their fate. Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy, and for the treason of Numenor there was no easy absolving. But Earendil did all that his father had bidden, and his ships lay off the east coast of the land. And the faithful put aboard their wives and their children and their heirlooms and great store of goods. Many things there were of beauty and power, such as the Numenorians had contrived in the days of their wisdom, vessels and jewels, and scrolls of lore written in scarlet and black. And 7 stones they had, the gift of the Eldar. But in the ship of Isildur was guarded the young tree, the scion of Nimloth the Fair. Thus Earendil held himself in readiness, and did not meddle in the evil deeds of those days, and ever he looked for a sign that did not come. Then he journeyed in secret to the western shores and gazed out over the sea, for sorrow and yearning were upon him, and he greatly loved his father. But naught could he descry save the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn gathering in the havens of the west. So that's a longer quote, but it is the crux of Amandil's story. He's going to try to recreate Earendil's journey from the First Age in order to save Numenor. But note the line, "Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy." Earendil's trip was unique, and he had two advantages that Amandil didn't have: Elwing and a Silmaril. Note that, like Earendil, Amandil had 3 mariners sail with him, a nice religious symbol. But Amandil is never heard from again. Numenor is destroyed, and as the passage says, nor is there any tale or guess of their fate. It's an intense conversation between father and son. They're trying to prepare for the apocalypse while also knowing that they're likely talking together for the last time. And Elendil journeying across Numenor to the western shore just to get one last glimpse of his father. It's devastating. But before we write off Amandil's suicidal quest as something ill-conceived, we do get this intriguing passage. "But whether or no it were that Amandil came indeed to Valinor, and Manwë hearkened to his prayer, by grace of the Valar, Elendil and his sons and their people were spared from the ruin of that day. For Elendil had remained in Ravenna, refusing the summons of the king when he set forth to war, and avoiding the soldiers of Sauron that came to seize him and drag him to the fires of the temple. He went aboard his ship and stood off from the shore, waiting on the time. There he was protected by the land from the great draught of the sea that drew all towards the abyss, and afterwards he was sheltered from the first fury of the storm. But when the devouring wave rolled over the land and Numenor toppled to its fall, then he would have been overwhelmed, and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish, for no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and agony of that day. But the great wind took him, wilder than any wind that men had known, roaring from the west, and it swept his ships far away, and it rent their sails and snapped their masts, hunting the unhappy men like straws upon the water. 9 ships there were, 4 for Elendil, and for Isildur 3, and for Anarion 2, and they fled before the black gale out of the twilight of doom into the darkness of the world. So we get the line, by grace of the Valar, Elendil and his sons and their people were spared. And we get this fortuitous wind out of the west, wilder than any wind that men had known, that essentially saves the lives of the faithful aboard those 9 ships. So, while Numenor is destroyed, Amandil's family and followers survive. I think the most likely outcome is that Amandil failed to reach Aman, but his attempt, his sacrifice for the good of his people, was noticed by the Valar, and they responded. As you probably realized, there's symbolism in Amandil's name. It means devoted to Aman. So his hopeful, courageous journey was not in vain. And if you want the Disney ending, the thought that perhaps Amandil did successfully reach Aman, here's the support for that interpretation. Remember how Elendil gazed in vain from the western shore of Numenor, searching for his dad? Well, after he settled in Middle-earth, and the 7 seeing stones, the Palantiri, were placed in their towers, there was one stone in particular, known as the Elendil stone, located on the western shore of Middle-earth, that Elendil was partial to. This passage is also from the Silmarillion, from the chapter entitled Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. It is said that the towers of Emun Bereid were not built indeed by the exiles of Numenor, but were raised by Gil-galad for Elendil, his friend. And the seeing stone of Emun Bereid was set in Elostirion, the tallest of the towers. Thither Elendil would repair, and thence he would gaze out over the sundering seas when the yearning of exile was upon him. and it is believed that thus he would at whiles see far away, even to the tower of Avalone upon Eressëa, where the Master Stone abode, and yet abides. These stones were gifts of the Eldar to Amandil, father of Earendil, for the comfort of the faithful of Numenor in their dark days, when the elves might come no longer to that land under the shadow of Sauron. They were called the Palantiri, those that watch from afar. So Earendil would gaze into this seeing stone, a gift from the elves to his father, and communicate in some way with the Master Stone on Tol Eressëa. It's the island off the coast of Aman that we talked about, whence the elves came to bring their gifts to Numenor long ago. Now that's a big if Amandil survived his voyage and arrived at Aman, we know from Earendil's experience that he would not be allowed to return to the east. Where might he live? With his friends the elves on Tol Eressëa. And he certainly knew how to use the seeing stones. The first thing he would try would be to use the Master Stone to communicate with his son, to let him know that he made it, to see if his son made it as well. So perhaps, during those hours Earendil spent gazing into the Earendil Stone, he was conversing with his father in the west. Maybe. So there you go, Amandil, my candidate for the Tolkien Reading Days theme of hope and courage. Thanks, everyone. And if you want to see more Tolkien Reading Day videos, there should be a playlist coming up on your screen. So thanks and